In today's video, I'll be making my updated 2025 gubernatorial election predictions as of today, August 24th of 2025. Although we're less than 2.5 months away from the election, it still feels like ages. Anyhow, I'll start off here with the state of Virginia, then move to New Jersey. Two states where there are very competitive races, despite the fact that these are comfortably Democratic leading states. Virginia currently has a Republican governor, and New Jersey has a Democratic governor who won by a very narrow margin, albeit both governors are term limited. Let's start off here with the Virginia race. Republican Lieutenant Governor Winsome Earl Sears is facing Democrat Abigail Spanberger. They both faced nominal opposition in the primaries, where their opponents both dropped out, and as a result, there was no primary data to really look at, and therefore there's not a lot of information about this race. One thing is pretty clear though. Abigail Spanberger, the Democrat, has a massive fundraising advantage at over $11 million, while the Republican candidate Winsome Sears only has about total raising of about 5.6 million and has about 4 million cash on hand, which means that the Republican is currently outraised about 3-1. That being said, that is actually pretty common. Republicans generally get out fundraised, and therefore there's not really anything to look at. Something that is certain though is that according to some of these general election predictions, this race ranges anywhere between tilt D to solid D. Now, State Navigate, I don't even know what that is. It doesn't seem like a very trustworthy source in my opinion. They added this prediction 2 days ago. This is definitely not a solid race. There's nothing really to look at. However, it does seem like most people do believe that this is a race that will go Democratic, albeit it is still a bit uncertain. So if we look at the polling right now according to different aggregates, including Real Clear Politics, Decision Desk HQ, and Race to the White House, Abigail Spanberger, the Democrat, is up by anywhere between 7 to 8%. Spanberger, according to these polling aggregates, is not at a majority yet, but she is quite close, compared to Winsome Sears being significantly and pretty far behind, and polls consistently show Abigail Spanberger ahead, especially in more recent polls. What does that mean? While polls does not necessarily indicate everything, it does seem like Abigail Spanberger has the advantage. Even though the fact that Winsome Sears being the lieutenant governor should have more name recognition than Abigail Spanberger being a former representative, it does seem like Spanberger has the advantage in this race. That is probably because Virginia has historically always voted against their own party in the White House. For example, 2021 with Biden in the White House, the state voted for Glenn Youngkin. In 2017 with Trump in the White House, it voted for Ralph Northam. In 2013, admittedly, it voted for Terry McAuliffe, even though there was a Democratic president, Barack Obama. 2009, it voted for a Republican, etc. The state generally votes against the party who is in the White House, and that is another historical factor in favor of the Democratic Party in this race. Finally, I want to look at the 2021 Virginia gubernatorial election results. While it is noteworthy that Glenn Youngkin, the Republican, actually won this race by 2, solidifying the fact that this race can actually still be won by a Republican, and that Virginia is still a state that could be competitive. It is important to mention that the state did take a lot of effort from Glenn Youngkin being somewhat of a moderate, someone who was willing to compromise with the Democratic Party, and someone who had a good name ID, versus Terry McAuliffe, who was historically one of the most unpopular governors in the state of Virginia, who was elected in 2013 by a razor-thin margin. It's also important to mention that Glenn Youngkin did very well in some of the areas like Virginia Beach, Chesapeake, Loudoun, and Prince William, narrowing down these heavily Democratic areas to flipping Virginia Beach and Chesapeake, while holding Loudoun and Prince William to 10 to 15% margins. Now, it is certainly still doable for a Republican, but Winsome Sears, regardless of her political positions, is not well known to be a moderate, and Kamala Harris still won the state of Virginia by 5.8%, even though she did pretty miserably nationwide, solidifying the fact that this will be a hard race for Republicans to flip, especially because Winsome Sears is not someone who is incredibly, outstandingly popular. this race will still probably go Democratic by 5 to 6%, establishing this race as a leading Democratic race, if not likely. I'm going to put it at likely as of right now. Now going to the state of New Jersey. New Jersey also has a competitive race, and in my opinion, far more competitive than the state of Virginia. Now we talk about the state of New Jersey. On face level here, Mikey Sherrill should be the next governor of the state of New Jersey. However, this race is fundamentally underrated by both political parties, as being a race where there could be actual political shockwaves sent across Washington, D.C. and nationwide. At face value, this doesn't seem like a really competitive race. The last time Republicans actually won a gubernatorial election in New Jersey was back in 2013. And if you look at the historical elections before 2024 in New Jersey, the last time the state of New Jersey was even competitive was with John Kerry back in 2004, and we know that coalitions back then were very different. Virginia went to Bush by 8.2, Colorado by 4.7, Texas by 22.9. Coalitions, the point is, were very, very different. And yet now the state is suddenly becoming more competitive. In 2021 here, Phil Murphy, the Democrat, only won by 3.22% as an incumbent governor. This race was not supposed to be competitive whatsoever. You look at the predictions, solid Democrat, likely Democrat. Polls had this easily going for Phil Murphy. He was over 50% in many polls. And guess what? This race became very competitive towards the end. Now, it was kind of because Phil Murphy was a not unpopular governor, but Jack Ciattarelli pretty much gave up at the end of his campaign. He knew he couldn't win, but he didn't know that this race would actually become very competitive. If you look at the state of New Jersey here in 2020, this was not a state that was actually competitive. The state easily voted for Biden by over 15%. However, in 2024 here, what we saw in New Jersey was that the state voted for Kamala Harris by less than 6%. This is the worst margin a Democrat has had in the state of New Jersey since, I believe, back in the 1992 election where Bill Clinton went against George W. Bush. It was a very different election, and the political climate back then was very, very different. The point is, this race historically has not been very competitive, but now it really has been. We have seen Republicans make major inroads in areas like Morris County and Passaic County, areas where Republicans historically has had no luck in, while Republicans have also made inroads in areas like Huston County, in areas like Union County, which are historically very Democratic and now slightly trending away from them and making this race far more competitive. There's another point in favor of the Republican Party. Democrats had a contested primary where Mikey Sherrill was often considered someone who was a poor quality candidate and someone who many progressives who supported Ross Baraka or some other moderates who supported Steve Fulop and Josh Gottenheimer did not really like Mikey Sherrill as a candidate. Many Democrats may still vote for her, but this race was more interesting, as opposed to the Republican primary, where there were little spars in this race. Trump still endorsed Jack Ciattarelli, and this race was more of a regional divide, where we saw that Jack Ciattarelli didn't do that well in the middle part of the state because Bill Spadilla was from that region, but other than that, there was no bitter divide. In the state of New Jersey here, Ross Baraka was more popular with progressives. Steve Sweeney in particular was more popular with the conservative Blue Dogs. And then Mikey Sherrill was popular within a subset of the more establishmentarian Democratic candidates. And as a result, this race became a very interesting race and could be competitive in 2025, especially after the shock in 2021. In the general elections here, Democrats are considered the leading favorites according to all four of the major prediction sources. While that does show that this race is still leading Democratic, again, there could be a political shock, and right now polls are not necessarily consistently suggesting that Mikey Sherrill would win. In 2021, what we saw was that, in the polling, Phil Murphy, the Democratic governor, was polling around 50%. He got 51% at the end. You say polls are pretty accurate. Well, if you look at the Republican share here, polls were predicting roughly a 40 to 44% share for Jack Ciattarelli, but Ciattarelli got 48%. If you apply the same logic to this, which I'm not saying is necessarily accurate, but something that could happen, what you could see is that actually if you apply that type of a difference, Chinarelli is within about 1 or 2%, or in some cases leading against Mikey Sherrill. What is also significant is that Mikey Sherrill has dipped in recent polling. What we see is that Jack Chiarelli was consistently behind, sometimes by huge margins in early pollsters, suggesting that Sherrill was already at 50%. But in more recent polls, Mikey Sherrill consistently struggles to get that 50% mark, while Jack Chiarelli is only a few points behind her. I'm not saying Chiarelli is the favorite. New Jersey is still a blue state, but this is an interesting state to look at. It's hard to say what will happen for sure, as in we don't really know if 2020 and 2021 were just that, a kind of fluke, or is this really significant? However, Jack Chiarelli is a relatively solid Republican candidate. New Jersey is certainly trending towards the Republican Party. The question is just how much, combined with Mikey Sherrill's unpopularity, makes this race very competitive. However, I still need more evidence if I want to give this as a Republican win in New Jersey, so I'm still going to give this to Sherrill by about 2% or a tilt margin. This is a very close race in my opinion. I could be dead wrong. Jack Chiarelli could win, or Sherrill could end up winning by 5 to 6%. But this is my best guess at this moment in time. Thank you so much for watching. Have a nice day. Goodbye.